Welcome to everybody joining us. Thanks so much for waiting. We were having a little bit of technical difficulties, but we're doing great now. And if you just be patient with us for a moment while I let everybody into the waiting room, and we'll begin shortly. All right, well, while we wait for everyone to join, I'll just give my little speech and then I'll turn it over to our docent. So thank you so much for joining our virtual talk today. Just as a reminder to keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you are joining us through Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We will be monitoring those comments and answering them at the end of the program as well. Please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you would like to rewatch this talk or watch previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Eleanor. Her talk is entitled, Tell Me a Story, Narratives and Art. Thank you, Eleanor, and with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Blythe. Good morning, everyone. Greetings and welcome to today's virtual tour with the Timken Museum. My name is Eleanor Merle and I'm a docent with the museum and delighted to be with you for today's tour of works that tell a story. In addition to the aesthetic beauty and the historic importance of a work of fine art is the story that unfolds on its canvas. One can truly read a painting as one does a book, identifying central characters and imagining the dialogue that takes place between them. Many of the true masters in art history are the great storytellers, those who stimulate our imaginations and bring their subjects to life on canvas. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the storytelling. We'll begin with our earliest work, and it's from the Timken collection, entitled The Torment of Saint Anthony by Giovanni Girolamo Savoldo. The work dates from between 1550 to 1520. Savoldo was a master of the Venetian Renaissance, and he was known for specializing in nocturnal scenes of religious subjects, like this bizarre and terrifying one, with dramatic contrasts between light and dark elements. Here we have the story of the temptation of Saint Anthony, told by his 4th century biographer, Saint Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. The Timken composition pivots around its depiction of an aged, robed figure in a landscape. Saint Anthony, a Christian saint and hermit, gave his wealth to the poor when he was a young man. Living in solitude, he devoted himself to prayer and meditation in the Egyptian desert, where he was tormented by temptations and terrible visions in the form of demons and evil spirits testing his faith. Savoldo presents Saint Anthony with his hands clasped in prayer, fleeing from a dark, hellish vision into a pastoral landscape bathed in warm daylight. The countryside here is rendered as a pure Venetian high Renaissance scene. Saint Anthony's hands direct the viewer to look toward the monastery in the background, providing safety. But he turns his head to stare back at the hellish inferno behind him. This is perhaps a reminder that Saint Anthony is considered the father of monasticism. On the right, monstrous and terrifying creatures romp in a hellish terrain, eerily lit by a giant fire representing hell in the background. These represent the throngs of demons sent in futile attempts to terrify Anthony into the abandonment of his faith. Through an archway in the center of the painting is a sailing ship, bathed in supernatural light that seems to be stranded. It's a metaphorical inference, perhaps, to the underworld. Now, a brief note about the demons. I bet some of you are thinking that the assortment of demons and tortures occupying the right half of the panel looks as if it could come from no other source than Hieronymus Bosch. And if you thought that, you're in fact correct. Like other northern Italian painters of the time, Savaldo was interested in Flemish painting, which was well known in Venice, particularly Hieronymus Bosch's nightmarish monsters. In fact, Savaldo copied specific visual elements from Bosch's Last Judgment triptych and included them in the Torment of St. Anthony. Here's an example of two of the creatures that Savaldo copied from Hieronymus Bosch. We've got the cowled gryllus and the man-eating fish bird. On the left is a detail of the creatures from Bosch's Last Judgment, and on the right, the same two from Savaldo's Torment of St. Anthony. Now, most scholars assert that Bosch was a devout Christian and intended his fantastic images to help admonish viewers to behave morally. This didn't stop him from satirizing corrupt and incompetent clergymen, however. He often dressed creatures in the habits of monks or nuns. So here, a whimsical gryllus in monk's cowl reads aloud from a Bible, while a variety of disgraceful things take place right under his nose. And in case you didn't know, a gryllus is an armless creature with a human face and head attached directly to the legs. Among the creatures performing atrocities before the oblivious mock clergyman is a man-eating fish bird that has strewn partly consumed victims at his feet. In Savaldo's version, the relative size and position of the cowled gryllus, the fish bird, and the scattered limbs are preserved. Even the principal colors of the group are closely copied from the Last Judgment, suggesting Savaldo took the figures directly from Bosch's painting. Savaldo painted a remarkably similar composition, The Temptation of St. Jerome, which is in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Like the Timkin slightly larger panel, the Pushkin's image is separated into two roughly equal parts. One, the light and good, and the other, the dark and bad. Both saints look up to the right toward a fiery menace. Jerome recoils as a large, nearly nude figure carrying a decaying body moves toward him. St. Anthony bears the same terrified look on his face. Now, another thing that the Saints Jerome and Anthony have in common is their association with pandemics. Saint Jerome is credited as an early recorder of bubonic plague in his translation of the Greek Bible to Latin. Similarly, a common but devastating illness known as St. Anthony's fire ravaged medieval Europe. Furthermore, the so-called Black Death was a recurrent part of Venetian life. At least 23 outbreaks were recorded in Venice between 1348 and 1528. Let's now travel south to the Academy of the Great Fine Arts Museum in Venice to take a look at a massive painting by Paolo Veronese, one of the most important Venetian artists of the 16th century. We in the Timken, of course, have one of his works. We'll be looking at his work, Feast in the House of Levi, except that it's not really, because it was originally meant to be, and actually still is, a Last Supper. But its title got changed, and therein lies the story. In 1573, the Dominicans of the convent of Saints John and Paul in Venice commissioned Paolo Veronese to paint the Last Supper scene. They wanted a traditional biblical scene to replace one previously painted by Titian that had been destroyed in a fire. The painting was destined for the monks' refectory, where they ate, and is one of the largest religious paintings of the 16th century. Now, while we see this work as a masterpiece, it was highly controversial at the time because it contained a noticeable amount of secular and profane imagery, which was deemed inappropriate to the subject. Religious painting in Italy was regulated by the carefully adhered to rules of the Council of Trent that forbade excessive use of decorative or aesthetic elements in canvases in case they detracted from the focal religious message. So when Veronese added a whole raft of ordinary people, some of whom seemed to be drunk, as well as merchants, Moors, German guards, jesters, animals, feasting without a care in the world, as if the holy party isn't really there, the elders of the church were horrified. We can well imagine that what they wanted was something like Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Now, shortly after the picture was completed, Veronese was summoned to appear before a tribunal of the Roman Catholic Inquisition to defend himself against charges of heresy. As he stood before his accusers, Paolo was acutely aware that he had to be careful in his response to their questions. His career and possibly his life were in jeopardy. Some of the questioning went along these lines. Question: why have you depicted buffoons, drunkards, Germans, dwarves, and other like fooleries? Paolo's answer: we painters take the same license as do poets and madmen, for ornament as one does. I was commissioned to adorn it as I thought proper. Now it is very large and can contain many figures. Question: who do you think had been present at the Last Supper? Paolo Veronese: I believe that there was only Christ and his apostles, but when I have some space left over in a picture, I adorn it with figures of my own invention. This reminds me of the criticism of Mozart for having too many notes in his music. Veronese repeatedly declared during the course of the cross-examination that the figures concerned were outside the place where the supper itself was taking place and had been shown at a proper distance from Christ. It must have been a trifle intimidating being questioned about his motives and his art, not wanting to fall afoul of the Inquisition and the Catholic Church. Veronese agreed on a solution to correct the picture according to the requests of the tribunal at his own cost within 3 months. But rather than alter the picture as directed, he simply changed the title of the painting to Feast in the House of Levi, the story of St. Matthew's conversion in the gospel, and the Inquisition was satisfied. So much for how we got here. Let's now take a look at what Veronese created. He painted what he knew best, people. He painted people in their outward public appearance, in realistic activities and attire for the era. He placed the Last Supper in a setting viewers could relate to, in many ways making it more human and accessible to its audience. What's so amazing about this painting is the vibrancy and range of colors and its realistic rendering as a supper that may have taken place in the grandeur of Veronese's Venice. The diversity of people in their cultural and social depictions highlights Venice as an important and eclectic center of trade, culture, and wealth in the late 16th century. With its crowded and vivid scene, Veronese's Feast in the House of Levi can be likened to a modern-day Jesus Christ superstar. The feast is framed by great pillars and archways reminiscent of a triptych in organization. The archways also call to mind tribunal arches, which in this context are a metaphor for Christ's triumph in regards to death, since he will be resurrected. Triumphal arches were common in ancient Rome and were positioned in highly visible areas where triumphal parades took place to bring attention to the events or people for which they were dedicated. These architectural features, as well as the patterned tiled floor, lead the eye to the central figure of Jesus sitting under the middle arch. Now, I'd like to hone in on a few of the figures Veronese depicted, and I'll show you the ones that we'll be talking about. First, of course, we'll be looking at the Last Supper. Then we'll be looking on the far right at the apostle leaning over the balustrade. Then we have the jester and the large man there, the man in the striped jacket, and finally on the far right, we've got two soldiers. The haloed Christ is depicted in a translucent salmon tunic with a dark blue cape. He's in deep conversation with St. John as St. Peter listens while helping himself to a leg of lamb. Even though they're the chosen ones, they're still shown in their human aspects. It's thus likely that it seemed entirely feasible to Veronese that Jesus would tolerate a cat gnawing and playing with a bone at his feet beneath the table, and a dog curiously looking on. The traitor Judas, the figure in dark red in the shadows to the right of St. John, on the opposite side of the table, is looking away from Christ, likely ashamed of the betrayal he's agreed to commit, knowing it will lead to Christ's crucifixion. He seems afraid that Jesus will see through him to the vile act in his heart, even as Jesus already knows what will happen. Now, quite unusual is the gesture of the apostle bending over the balustrade on the far right in orange, a long way from the main event. He's distributing bread from the Lord's table to the needy. This has been seen as an allusion to the distribution of the communion wafer at the Eucharist. The gesture seems to be intended to remind the Dominicans who commemorated the Last Supper during their shared daily meal in the refectory, not to forget the obligation of charity. To the left of the central archway, we see a wealthy man in his sumptuous green clothes and a figure dressed as a jester with a parrot perched on his hand. When asked by the Inquisition as to why the jester, Veronese answered, and I quote, "He's decorative, as is customary." To the right of the central archway is a corpulent Venetian guest who comes across as rather inebriated, his belly full of food and wine, his striped robe somewhat disheveled and saggy, his skin pallid and sweaty, as if he's suffering the after effects of a little too much indulgence. And finally, further to the right are two German soldiers with halberds, which is a two-handed pole weapon. One is eating and the other is drinking. Veronese told the Inquisition that it seemed appropriate to him that the wealthy owner of this house, a noble, he understands, would have hired security such as these men. Born Paolo Cagliari in Verona, Italy, the son of a stonemason, his birthplace is immortalized in his artistic name, Veronese. By the age of 15, his painting and use of color were already extremely proficient and advanced. Even though still an apprentice, he was already beginning to paint parts of an altarpiece in Verona by himself. By his late teens, he was being commissioned by churches to produce entire works. Veronese's art was extremely popular during his life and after his death. And if pomp and splendor was your pleasure, I doubt anyone else could have outshone or outdone Paolo Veronese. While Veronese was the quintessential Italian Renaissance artist, the Bruegel family of Flemish painters dominated art of the Northern Renaissance, particularly renowned for their great genre pieces, with villagers and revelers as their subjects. This oil painting by Peter Bruegel the Younger is a particularly exceptional example of the family's output. Entitled The Alchemist, this work takes its inspiration from the 1558 drawing by his father, Peter Bruegel the Elder. Bruegel deftly weaves the tale of this foolhardy alchemist who is on the left, hunched over his work and surrounded by a multitude of instruments in his makeshift laboratory. In the right-hand image, you can see the alchemist aided by the scholar who reads a text titled Algemist, meaning all is lost, as well as the fool frantically and foolishly feeding air into the fire. In the left-hand image, we see the alchemist's wife standing next to him, watching him throw their last gold coin into the crucible as she searches in vain through her flat purse. The artist reveals the conclusion of the story through the window in the back of the right-hand image in a clever example of a painted narrative, showing the ill-fated family being welcomed by the church, the giver of charity. The intricate work depicts a subject of great interest of the time, the alchemist. The science of alchemy, or the attempt to transform one metal into another, was practiced from antiquity through the 17th century. Beginning in the 15th century, the practice was first known to attract frauds and con men. And by the time Bruegel the Elder came along, the practice was completely discredited. This scene offers a rather satirical portrait of the alchemist at work, standing as a symbol of man's folly in their quest for unearned gold, leading to their ruin. The eldest son of Peter Bruegel the Elder, Peter Bruegel the Younger, was born in Brussels in 1565. He's known for numerous copies after his father's work, as well as his own original compositions. The large output of his studio, which produced for the local and export market, contributed to the international spread of his father's imagery. His highly detailed images and allegorical subjects made him the most famous artist of his day. I think we're now ready for some relief, and there's no artist better than Francois Boucher painting in the fanciful Rococo style to lighten our mood. Boucher's work is represented in the Timken with Lovers in a Park, a pastoral composition of 1758. The display of nonchalant whimsy and carefree demeanor reflects the time. This, like Feast of Levi in the House of Levi, is a huge canvas. It's more than 7.5 feet high, and Boucher has conjured up a fairy tale vision of a lush landscape peopled with graceful and sweet-tempered figures. The delicate pastel color scheme and the fluid painting technique, most vivid in the creamy folds of the seated woman's dress and the richly worked foliage of the trees and bushes, epitomize Boucher's Rococo style, which by the 1750s had reached a level of virtuosity unparalleled by the artist's contemporaries. The subject, such as it is lighthearted and whimsical, in keeping with the essentially decorative character of the painting. An amorous young couple, perhaps out for a stroll in the countryside or the grounds of an estate, has stopped to rest beneath a sculpture of two Amorini who look in the same directions as the lovers. A spaniel in the foreground likely represents fidelity. Interestingly, it turns away from the couple. The man has taken flowers from the woman's hat and is weaving them into her hair, and her thoughts appear to wander. His attention, meanwhile, is distracted by the appearance of a young girl. Her less elaborate costume suggests she's a milkmaid or shepherdess who walks into the scene, and she's been gathering flowers, which she carries in baskets. A dove house is in the background. Now, the artist took great care in arranging the postures, gestures, and glances of the figures to create a harmonious, well-balanced composition. Note that all the pastel colors used in the painting are also in the bouquet of flowers in the woman's upturned hat on the right of the composition. And the light comes from the front, as in a theater, which reminds us that Boucher also created stage designs. During the 18th century, it was fashionable for the aristocracy to escape from the strict etiquette of the French court by going to secluded rustic retreats and living there as though they were simple country people. On those retreats, they dressed in elaborate versions of peasant clothing and strolled in private gardens. The lovers' satin clothes show that they're aristocrats, but the milkmaids' beribboned garments are the kind of idealized peasant garbs sported for fun by royal and aristocratic ladies of the time. Marie Antoinette went so far as to have built this Hermitage on the left on the property of Versailles in 1749. Madame Pompadour wrote to her friend, Madame de Luxembourg, "I spent half my life at the Hermitage." Compare it with the very formal and manicured Garden of Versailles on the right. Francois Boucher was born in Paris, where he would die in 1770. He was first taught by his father, Nicholas, who was a decorator who specialized in embroidery. He then studied under an esteemed engraver, and during this time he engraved many of Watteau's drawings and became familiar with Watteau's Rococo style. By the time he was 18, he'd been awarded the Prix de Rome, a scholarship to study in Italy. And when he returned to Paris after 5 years, he was admitted to the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. He gained the acclaim and attention of royalty and soon was winning commissions from the French crown and aristocracy, which earned him an international reputation of much renown. He became Madame de Pompadour's favorite artist, which bode well for him, being that she was Louis XV's official chief mistress and very influential. Boucher essentially became her personal painter. Now, there was controversy later in his career, as Boucher received some moral criticism from people such as Diderot, the French philosopher, for themes present in his work. Blonde Odalisque was thought to depict a 2-year affair of King Louis XV. A caustic comment 3 years after the Timkins' Lovers in a Park was painted underscores Diderot's ambivalent view of Boucher as a brilliant but misguided painter. Quote, "What colors, what variety, what a richness of objects and ideas. The man is capable of everything except the truth." Enough for whimsy and frivolity, and on to our last work, turning to a more serious subject matter. In 1785, visitors to the Paris Salon were transfixed by one painting, Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii. It was absolutely new. No one had ever seen anything like it before. As we just saw with Boucher, the prevailing style in France was the Rococo, a style that appealed to the aristocracy. David's work established a new style that we call neoclassicism. Similar subjects had always been seen in the salons before, but the physicality and intense emotion of the painting was new and undeniable. To tell the story of the oath, David created a rigorously organized painting with a scene set in what might be a Roman atrium, dominated by 3 arches at the back that keep our attention focused on the main action in the foreground. The story of the Oath of the Horatii came from a Roman legend, first recounted by the Roman historian Livy, involving a conflict between the Romans and a rival group from nearby Alba. Rather than continue a full-scale war, they elect representative combatants to settle their dispute. The Romans select the Horatii, and the Albans choose another trio of brothers, the Horatii. The moment David chose to represent was, in his reported words, quote, "the moment which must have preceded the battle, when the elder Horatius, gathering his sons in their family home, makes them swear to conquer or die." On the right are 3 women and 2 children. The women know that they will also bear the consequences of the battle because the 2 families are united by marriage. One of the wives in the painting is a daughter of the Horatii, and the other, Camilla, is engaged to one of the Horatii brothers. At the end of the legend, the sole surviving Horatii brother kills Camilla, who condemned his murder of her beloved, accusing Camilla of putting her sentiment above her duty to Rome. Before composing Oath of the Horatii, David went to see Poussin's Rape of the Sabine Women, and he employed the lictor, the red cape man in the upper far left, as the basis for the Horatii, directly quoting other figures from Poussin as well. Even though Poussin was his model, David knew that he was creating a new type of painting, and he wrote, I quote, "I do not know whether I shall ever paint another like it," end quote, as he developed the austere composition and powerful physiques. Jacques-Louis David was born in Paris into a wealthy family. His father was an iron merchant who was killed in a duel when David was just 9 years old. His mother came from a family of builders and architects, which was what they wanted David to become. But he favored painting from an early age and won them over. His first teacher, in fact, was Boucher, to whom he was distantly related. And certainly you see the influence of Boucher and the Rococo style in this early work by David, who was just 25 at the time. Mademoiselle Guimard was a celebrated dancer and courtesan. Interestingly, Fragonard, who was a student also of Boucher, had originally been commissioned for the painting, but he had had a falling out with Mademoiselle Guimard, and the young unknown David was chosen to step in. As a trivia note, and I would welcome anyone, would anyone like to guess in 2013 what this work sold for? This is today's trivia question. Okay, I will tell you, $340,000. I don't know if that's more or less what you would think it would be. It's almost a bit less than what I would think, but it is a young David, and it's certainly not his neoclassical style. When David was finally awarded the Prix de Rome after 4 attempts, he left for Italy, where he studied the works of Raphael and the 17th century masters. He visited and became deeply impressed with the classical ruins, deepening his belief in the virtue of classical culture over the indulgent Rococo style. He returned to Paris in 1780 and was made an official member of the Royal Academy. But David was more than a painter. He was as political an artist as ever lived. He was a leader of the French Revolution, a prominent member of the radical Jacobin Party, and a close friend of the infamous tyrant Maximilien Robespierre, leader of the Reign of Terror. When Robespierre fell from power and was guillotined, David was imprisoned. This self-portrait is David's third and last, painted when he was 46 years old during his imprisonment for defending Robespierre. This brings us to the close of our tour. I hope you enjoyed today's storytelling. I welcome, of course, any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was really lovely. And yeah, as Eleanor said, right now we'd love to welcome any of your questions or comments. Feel free to use that chat feature at the bottom of your page. And let me just see if there's any Facebook Live questions that we have now as well. So everyone on Facebook just says very informative and great presentation. So thank you so much for that, Eleanor. I personally, I really loved the inclusion of the Hermitage gardens. I think those are so great. I think, and the Rococo style, they really match up really well. And it was just really enjoyable to see it. So it's so fun. And I loved your, description of it being whimsical. It really is. So if nobody has any questions, I'd like to just remind you, if you're on Facebook Live with us, to like our videos and our posts on Facebook, and that way we can reach a wider audience. We've been seeing some great presence from people in other countries who have been telling us about their locations, and that's been really fun. So we just love to keep that up. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Eleanor.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, of course. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next week for our presentation given by one of our docents, The Golden Age in Spain. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.